This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Jonathan, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast.
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having me back.
Glad to do it. And I just want to warn the folks at home, I think once you see this episode and then what's coming, what we have in store for you for next week, it will just be MMT all the time. I think it'll be 3 episodes in a row of the Human Action Podcast devoted to MMT because, Jonathan, we had Patrick Newman, no relation, right, to you?
No relation.
Besides your Austrian blood. Talking about the talk or one of the talks he gave on your panel at the AERC recently, having to do with GDP statistics, or GNP at the time, and the relationship to the MMT debate. So maybe partly to give a commercial for your upcoming book that you're the editor of, but also in case some of the listeners are understandably thinking, Murphy, why are you devoting so much time to MMT? Why don't you talk about something else? Can you explain why are you the editor of this upcoming book project? And, why do you think that's a valuable use of your scholarly efforts?
Yeah. Before I get into that, I'll just say I saw a very funny tweet from Stephanie Kelton about all this. I can't remember what exactly she was responding to. I think it was maybe the tweet from the Mises account of the Anti-MMT panel that we did at AERC. Mm-hmm. And she said, MMT is a job guarantee for Austrians, which I thought was funny.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I mean, there's a tiny bit of truth to that. What would economists do if everybody was right about economics, and we had laissez-faire policies? Like, what would we spend our time doing if there weren't these errors to correct? It'd be minimal. But of course,
I think I would like to be working like a bookstore somewhere. Maybe I could see myself even just getting coffee for people. I could do that.
Yeah. But anyway, I thought it was funny. But the MMT panel is just one session out of the whole of AERC, and so it's not like we're just singularly focused on MMT and refuting it. So it's just this one session, and what we're doing is we were presenting the research that we've been doing, the papers and chapters that we've been drafting to go into this book, the Anti-MMT book. I'm not sure if we're going to land on that title. Might do something different. But the goal is to collect Austrian critiques of MMT. So as I've said before, and you've said as well, Austrian economics is especially suited to critique MMT. And it's not just because the policy prescriptions are very different. So Austrians are obviously very laissez-faire, government hands-off. MMT is like government all the way. It's not just because of that, but they're making very specific claims that Austrians have a very good counter to. We have this history of understanding of the nature of money, where how money got started, also about public finance, as you talked about with Patrick last week about national income accounting statistics. So we have all of this in our arsenal. And while throughout the 20th century, Austrian economists would critique the Keynesian system, now we have this new school of thought in front of us that it's slightly different than the Keynesian school, but there's new things. They're saying new and different things that's available for us to present our not just a refutation or a critique, but also to present the positive theory that the Austrian school has. And that's really my main goal for the book, is to do both. So show people here's where MMT is wrong, here's where they're misleading, that sort of thing, but also give people a preview of what economic theory does the Austrian school have to offer. And so that's why when you see us critique their theory of the origins of money, you'll see the Austrian theory of the origins of money. When you see Lucas Engelhardt, for example, present the flaws in the job guarantee policy prescription, you'll also see him present what Hutt had to say about the theory of vital resources. So it's a book that's going to do both.
Great, yeah, and the things I would add, just to sort of complement what you just said there, that I think Austrians are particularly well suited to offer this rebuttal to the MMT talking points or their framework, let's say, is, as you say, they, like the origin of money, a lot of mainstream economists don't even think about that. Like, that's not, that's just, well, no, in our model, we have the money, and what are you talking about, And then, so the Austrians came to history. And the other thing, too, is just like you say with the accounting, since a lot of the MMT mystique comes from their either national income accounting approach or just getting into like the creation of money via bank lending, a lot of mainstream economists can't even read a balance sheet, like literally. And so in that realm, like they can't, like there's an anecdote, I think it's Larry Summers, I hope I'm not misspeaking, but it's Mosler is telling the anecdote where he was in meeting with powerful people in Washington, D.C., and he was making his points, and then somebody else walks into the room or was sitting there, I can't remember the exact way the story goes, and it's a big name household mainstream economist. I think it's Larry Summers, but I could be wrong about that. And then the DC power broker guy, hearing Mosler explain stuff, looks up to Larry and says, "Is this true?" And then Summers, according to Mosler's telling of it, says, "Well, I never really got into reserve accounting, so I can't speak to that." But it had to do something with, I think the guy had asked Summers, "What's the problem with the budget deficit?" And then Summers had said, "Well, it siphons resources away, from the private sector and reduces private investment," or something like that. And so, if the government has too big of a budget deficit, that's the problem. And then Mosler said, "No, it doesn't," and gave some appeal to the way the money moves around with the Fed and the Treasury in terms of internally in the system. And then the power broker said to Summers, "Is that true?" And he couldn't deal with Mosler and Mosler's universe. He could just say, "Well, I don't know how bank reserve accounting works. I'm just saying this is what I know as an economist." So anyway, because of stuff like that, where that story I just told was making the rounds on Twitter like a week ago. And of course, all the MMTers are running victory laps, and I understand why they would think, haha. But anyway, so that's why the Austrians, I think, agreeing with you, Jonathan, were the best ones to do it. And then probably, too, there's a bit of, we're not going to make an appeal to, "Oh, you guys are a bunch of cranks. Who cares? Why don't you get some bigger influence or footprint on the profession before we take you seriously?" For obvious reasons that Austrians know appealing to popularity or, well, gee, are you guys teaching at Harvard, isn't really the way to settle an argument. So we have two recent episodes that we're going to talk about, folks, today in the Human Action podcast. One is you were responding to a Stephanie Kelton tweet, but in order for the folks at home to understand what she's talking about in the context, we need to first play a clip where Ted Cruz recently was talking with Elon Musk, and it was a recorded affair, and then Cruz tweeted it out, and this shocking new revelation of what Elon just told me about the way our treasury works. So we'll go ahead and play that clip.
One of the things you told me about is what you call insane. Magic money computers at the Treasury. So tell us about it, because I never heard of that until you brought that up.
Okay, so you may think that that the government computers all talk to each other, they synchronize, they add up what funds are going somewhere, and it's it's coherent. There's and that the numbers, for example, that you're presented as a senator, are actually the real numbers.
One would think.
One would think. They're not.
Yeah.
Okay. They're not totally wrong, but they're probably off by 5% or 10% in some cases. So I call a magic money computer any computer which can just make money out of thin air. That's magic money.
So how does that work?
It just issues payments.
And you said there's something like 11 of these computers at Treasury that are sending out trillions in payments?
They're mostly at Treasury. Some are, but there's some at HHS, there's one or two at State, there's some at DOD. I think we found now 14 magic money computers.
14, okay.
They just send money out of nothing.
Okay, so before we dive into Kelton's use of that to make her zinger on Twitter, Jonathan, let me just respond to that particular exchange. I think it's possible that Elon is a little bit overstating what the situation is in that clip. All right, so I don't doubt that there are, whatever he said, up to 14 separate entities that have the ability to issue payments, coming from the U.S. Treasury ultimately, and that they don't, before that they issue those payments, they don't like sort of tap a central database to make sure that, the pile of money that we have available at our disposal, if we not overdrawn that account or something, and that, it's a looser oversight. But nonetheless, I still believe it is, and I haven't seen anyone dispute this, that since like the early 1980s, Congress specifically enacted a rule saying that the Treasury was not allowed to overdraft its account with the Federal Reserve, right? So, companies can have corporate accounts, checking accounts at major banks and so on, and large banks have reserve accounts with the Federal Reserve itself, right? Like the Fed is the banker's bank, and the Treasury is one of these entities, these institutions that has, as it were, a checking account with the Fed. And when the Treasury pays for things, ultimately what ends up happening, the Fed sends Joe Blow a check, he deposits it at Bank of America, where his personal checking account is. Ultimately what happens is the Fed reduces the Treasury's account with the Fed and credits Bank of America's. And that's all, to keep everything square behind the scenes in terms of the accounting. And so I'm saying since the early 80s, it's illegal. The Fed is not supposed to let the Treasury engage in an overdraft. Okay, and I think the MMTers all agree with that, and they just say, well, that's just a quibble in the big picture. If you view the Fed and the Treasury as a combined entity, they can buy whatever they want. The money, finding the money is not an issue. So my point is just with Elon's little anecdote there, both the right and the left, I think, were reading too much into that, right? The people on the right, like the reason Ted Cruz tweeted that out was because he thought his fan base would be alarmed by it. It's like, do you agree? Whereas the MMTers were circulating the same tweet saying, see, we told you so, you idiots. Like they thought that was a great thing. Like, thank goodness we have these magic money computers and we can pay for things, and finding the money is not an obstacle. It's just real resource constraint, right? So my point is, I think both of them were misconstruing what the actual situation is pertaining to the way the U.S. government finances itself right now. Do you want to say anything on that before we jump into what Kelton did?
I'll just add, there was that difference in response between the right and the MMTers, but on the left, including the MMTers, there was also this sort of difference in responses. When you look at the replies under, I think it was Ted Cruz who put it out, or maybe it was Elon who tweeted it out.
I think it was originally Ted Cruz, and then Elon, I think, retweeted it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But if you look at the replies, there are people on the left who were saying, this is preposterous. There's no way that this is true. If this were true, then it would have been found out ages ago, and a court would have struck it down or declared that this is unconstitutional. It's impossible. But then you had other people on the left, especially the MMTers, saying, see, we told you so. This is exactly how public finance works. This is exactly how government spending creates new units of money and pushes it out into the economy. Yeah. So it's just interesting that you see that MMT hasn't captured the entire left.
Right. Okay, so now that folks, for what it's worth, have that as the context, it was interesting. Stephanie Kelton on March 17th tweeted out, there was this article that had dropped in The Guardian talking with spreadsheets of empire. Red tape goes back 4,000 years, say scientists after Iraq finds. And then Kelton's, commentary as she's posting this article from The Guardian is to say, imagine a couple of scientists discovering these and being like, quote, I found 14 magic money tablets that send money out of nothing. So why don't I just stop right there? And Jonathan, can you explain, what do you think she was trying to say here? Because there were a lot of people who, including myself, I'm not even sure what her point was besides just, making a joke and everyone kind of ha-ha because they vaguely get what she's talking about, but not really, like, I don't even know if her joke makes sense on its own terms. But can you explain what point you think she thought she was making?
Yes, I think what she's saying is she's referring to these tablets and saying that these represent the earliest form of fiat money. They represent the earliest form of the government instituting what money is going to be and then issuing it, using it to buy things. And the reason why I think that is because you can look at other MMTers, including herself, who have referred to these clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. And people like Randall Wray say that these were money. He cites A. Mitchell Innes, who says that these were money. I'm not as well versed in David Graeber's work. I plan to read some of his book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, but I understand that he also references these.
It's pretty slow the first 4,000, just so you know.
Anyway, so they all claim that these clay tablets were the first money. They say that they were debts denominated in grain, and people would exchange these things, and these tablets served as a unit of account for the public administrators to keep track of debts and how much has been issued, how many have been collected back in taxes. And so I use this as an opportunity to just, I guess, give a preview of the sort of research that I was doing, because when I looked at Ray and Innes, they didn't cite any historical research on these tablets. They didn't point to any archaeological research about these tablets, what they were. They just sort of made these claims about them, saying that these were money. They were all debts denominated in grain, and this served as the basis for the first fiat monetary system. And not only that, the first money, right? So they were. This is the oldest example I can find from the MMTers and the Chartalists saying this is the first money. And so when I did my own research, I'm looking at the archaeologists and the historians that know the cuneiform, and so they're translating the tablets. And
Can I just stop you for a second, John, to make sure people aren't getting confused? So the recent find in Iraq was like the oldest yet that had been discovered, but you're saying, so it's not that you went and did research on these things that had just been discovered recently that was the news, Hook the Kelton was just behind it, but you're saying the genre of looking at these ancient tablets that have records of, bureaucratic transactions and temple taxes and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. That's what you have gone and looked into.
Yes.
Yeah.
So these clay tablets with the cuneiform writing. So I was just looking into what do archaeologists and historians say about them. Mm-hmm. That's what I was looking into. And what I found is that the broad, virtually 100% consensus among historians and archaeologists that have looked at these tablets and dug up stuff out of the ground, they all say that silver was money during this time period, going back to the 3rd millennium BC. And so that I used this. I had originally had a different topic that I was going to write about for the Anti-MMT book, but then when I discovered that there was this clear consensus and all this archaeological research that clearly refutes the Chartalist claim that these tablets were money, when all of the archaeologists are saying that silver was money, and they have the evidence to support it and the translations of the tablets to support it, I decided to switch topics. And as I sort of drop previews of it, it's been entertaining to see how the MMTers respond to it. But yeah, we don't have to go into all of that drama. Do you want me to give
drama, can I just let me read something from my response to Graeber, because it dovetails exactly with what you're saying, and just to make sure the Human Action Podcast listeners get what we're saying here, because and then I do want to get into the drama, because I haven't heard any decent response. I mean, typically the way MMTers respond to my articles is because I do a lot of stuff with intertemporal capital and interest theory, and I always start, like, imagine Robinson Crusoe on the island, and they always let me know that, Bob, do you know in modern economies people don't use coconuts for money, which was news to me. But so anyway, that's typically so I actually don't know exactly what the MMT response would be to what you said. So I do want to hear that. But let me just
don't get your hopes up. There's not much good there.
Okay. So again, folks, what the claim is that the MMTers will spend a lot of time, and this is also a preview what I'm going to do next week on a solo episode here, folks, where I'm going to go through a Randall Wray. He gave a talk at I think it was to like a college undergrad class on, the MMT's approach to money or something like that, and how it differs from the mainstream. And so, one of their big whipping boys is they will hold up the standard economist explanation of the origins of money. And they say, first they think there was barter, and then because of the inefficiencies of barter, people settled on some commodity that was universally accepted, and blah, blah, blah. And then only later did sophisticated bank credit emerge. And then finally we got fiat currency. And they say, no, if you actually go read the archaeologists instead of sitting in your armchair and theorizing like these ideologue Austrians and others do, if you actually go and look at the history, you'll see, number one, there's no record of a barter economy anywhere. Like, anthropologists have never found some village somewhere that relies on a barter economy, and we don't have any historical records. And then the second thing they'll say is what we do have, the ancient, going back as far as records are, the archaeological digs and blah, 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 from ancient civilizations, as far back as we can document, is that you have a sophisticated, bureaucratic, state-dominated society where the ruling political authorities dictated what the money was. And you say, well, geez, how, did they have records saying about how, we went from a state where there was no money and then, chief so-and-so declared this is money? No, let me just give you an example of the kind of thing. So this is coming from David Graeber's book. I did a review of it. And by the way, it was run, my review, we'll link to it, of course, folks, was run in the American Conservative, and they gave the best article title to this that I've had on any of my articles. They called it Origin of the Species, like hard money species. Yeah. So origin. So anyway, that's good. The title they gave was better than my article. And so, so I quote a little bit of Graeber, dunking in his mind on the standard economist. But there's no record of any barter economy anywhere. What the heck? And then, but this is where he gets into explaining how archaeologists and others know that, yes, the standard economist textbook story is just wrong. And this is like an example where he thinks, clearly we're right, that the state created money. And this is what he says. He's talking about the economy of the ancient Sumerians here, right? So that's why, Jonathan, I thought I should go ahead and just high five you. So this is Graeber writing in his book. The basic monetary unit was the silver shekel. 1 shekel's weight in silver was established as the equivalent of 1 gur, or bushel, of barley. A shekel was subdivided into 60 minas, corresponding to 1 portion of barley, and temple workers received 2 rations of barley every day. It's easy to see that money, in this sense, is in no way the product of commercial transactions. It was actually created by bureaucrats in order to keep track of resources and move things back and forth between departments. Okay, so he's saying the money was created by the bureaucrats just as a internal bookkeeping operation. And so if you know more about MMT and what they say about the modern monetary system, you can see why this origin story fits in with their framework, right? That money's not a commodity that emerged spontaneously from voluntary transactions out there in the world. It was established by, political or religious authority figures, and it was just arbitrary. So then what I said, this is me writing now in my review, of all the thousands of goods they could have chosen, or they could have simply invented some arbitrary accounting unit since there was allegedly no relation to commerce, the temple bureaucrats happened to choose the very commodity that in the modern market serves as money, clearly for the reasons that Menger and others cite. This is an astounding coincidence. Because the historical evidence shows temple bureaucrats relying on an accounting system based on silver, David Graeber concludes that the bureaucrats chose to designate silver as the money. And then it gets worse for his case. Graeber later, in his narratives says, in the marketplaces that cropped up in Mesopotamian cities, prices were also calculated in silver, and the prices of commodities that weren't entirely controlled by the temples and palaces would tend to fluctuate according to supply and demand. Okay, so what the actual historical record shows, the archaeologists, is that they knew out there, in the marketplace, and I didn't quote it right there, but elsewhere says, or when the people would be trading with others, from a distant land where you didn't know if you were going to see them anytime soon, silver was what was used, and prices were quoted in silver. And then also they had records showing that the temple bureaucrats, when they had to just come up with some internal bookkeeping mechanism, happened to also pick silver. And Graeber's explanation is clearly what happened here is that the temple bureaucrats just arbitrarily picked silver as the unit of account, and then that's why everybody out in the marketplace said, oh, I guess we should use silver now when we denominate our transactions. It's like, notice with Bitcoin, Bitcoin's an arbitrary thing, right? Like it's not a pound of Bitcoin, right? No one talks like that because that really is an arbitrary unit of accounting. So we know what would happen if something really were arbitrary. You wouldn't call it a weight of something. Yet all the historical things, the pound and anyway. So I will stop there. I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to weigh in, but I think I'm making the point obvious, right? That the historical record is exactly what you would expect to see if Menger were right about where money comes from. And it's not at all what you would, or at the very least, it's an astounding coincidence because there's no reason they needed to pick anything physical. And there's no reason they needed to pick something that is, divisible, has a convenient weight, and, all the reasons that the Austrians could give as to why the market naturally gravitated to gold and silver. None of that matters according to the MMT origin story. And yet they happen to pick silver. That just seems like an astonishing coincidence. It'd be like saying, I don't care about looks, and you're married to a supermodel. Maybe, but anyway.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because there's actually two different stories. As soon as you bring up silver, it's almost like they grant you, silver was money, but that it had to originate by the power of the state. But what's interesting is if you look at Ray and Innes, they don't say that silver was money. They say that the clay tablets, in fact, they say that they circulated, that they were exchanged. Right, so there's two stories here, and it's just one way that the MMTers are sort of squirmy. But yeah, in my research, I'm basically just making the case that the historical evidence totally vindicates Menger, and not only that, it refutes the MMT chartalist story, and especially if you want to claim that taxes drive the demand for money, that's a key claim in the MMT framework, is they say that the demand for money and how money originates is through the state's ability to tax. And so what I found, I was just looking through these ancient tax systems, and all of the ancient tax systems in this area, in Egypt and in Mesopotamia and elsewhere, the states were collecting taxes in kind. They were collecting like goats, cattle, grain, that sort of thing. So their tax system was based on that. And only later did they start to tax silver, which means that the MMTers can't say, okay, yeah, fine, maybe during this specific time period that you're looking at, the silver was used in a few exchanges. But if that's the case, then probably the ancient Mesopotamian state was collecting taxes in silver, and that's what caused market participants to start to use it as money, or to demand it as money. But if I looked at the historical research, and so like there's this great book by Sharlock 2004 where she says silver appears with extreme rarity in the hundreds or even thousands of the Ur-3 dynasty, the third dynasty in Ur, tablets that record the tax payments. So they weren't collecting silver in taxes; they were collecting in kind. However, at the same time, we have a record of silver being used to make payments, and also when people are trying to figure out the value of certain things, you can tell that they're thinking in silver terms. You might have seen in the screenshots from a different book from the University of Chicago, where it's like all of these different tablets, all these different letters from one ancient Babylonian to another one, where they're saying, please send 2 3/4 of a shekel of silver worth of food to me, right? So that you can clearly see that they're all using silver in their transactions, and it wasn't because of this ancient tax system. It wasn't because of a decision by the state. It seems to me that it just totally vindicates Menger, and it shows how money originated from the market as people were choosing a more saleable good.
Oh yeah, just thank you for hitting that distinction, because I hadn't caught that. I thought your point was just to show they were using silver, but you're right. So I'll just read one of the screenshots you sent, or you tweeted out. So some guy, tell him that Bellinum sends the following message: may the god Samas keep you in good health. Make ready for me the myrtle and the sweet-smelling reeds of which I spoke to you, as well as a boat for transporting wine to the city of Sipar. Buy and bring along with you 10 silver shekels worth of wine, and join me here in Babylon sometime tomorrow. And so again, folks, just to make sure you're getting the subtle point Jonathan is making there, he didn't say go buy 10 bottles of wine, or buy a month's worth of wages of fine wine. He was saying, and he wasn't even just saying, bring me 10 shekels of silver, and because I'm going to go buy some wine with it. He was saying, he was telling him bring a certain amount of physical wine, but the units that he used to express that were silver shekels worth of it. So that's Jonathan's point, is even though there you wouldn't have seen silver physically moving around in terms of what the guy was bringing, you could see it was denominated, and that's consistent, Jonathan. What your point is that it's pretty standard that in like poorer regions, especially like the further back in time you go, where it's more primitive conditions, that the official coinage, like of metallic money, can be used by merchants and bankers and whatnot. But the common peasants, don't have easy access. You might say money is dear or scarce. It would be like a language they would use. And so, yes, if the local tax collector, you serfs or whatever, whoever have to pay homage or tribute, they might show up with rabbits and things like that, or eggs, because they're not using coins in day-to-day commerce, even though that would be the money. It's not like it's a rabbit economy. It's, silver or gold or whatever. And so that record is fully borne out with what you're saying with these ancient tablets, that we know the merchant class and that people were thinking in terms of silver as the money, but yet a lot of the taxes weren't paid in that. And again, just to drive the point home, might be redundant at this point, folks, but Jonathan is saying that is the exact opposite of what you would see if the MMT origin story were true. According to the MMTers, the only reason the merchants are using silver, the only reason these letters and whatnot that we have records of saying, bring me 10 shekels of silver worth of wine, exist like that, is because the authorities first imposed taxes in silver completely arbitrarily. They could have picked anything. They happened to pick silver for some reason. And then that's what made everyone in the community say, oh, well, I got to get silver because I got to pay the tax man. And so that's why I'm willing to sell my bottles of wine for silver, because I need to go pay that. So anyway, I probably belabored that, but I just want to make sure that people get the critical point you're making, that the evidence, the more we look into it, it's not just that it's neutral. Like, if it's way more consistent with the Austrian story than with the MMT story.
Yeah, great point. And actually, that's a great segue to the other main thing that I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned coins when you were just speaking. And so this is a huge rhetorical tactic by the MMTers. They say, you idiots, coinage didn't come around until much later. And so like they point to all of these tablets and all the trade that was done, and they say that this was the origin of money. And you idiot Austrians don't even realize that coins didn't come until much later in history. So how can you say that that was the origin of money? And of course, like Menger had never said that money originated with coinage. This is just it's a straw man on their part. And so when you look at the archeological record and like what they're digging out of the ground, what they found are these hack silver hoards. And so I talked a little bit about that in my presentation at AERC, and I'll also discuss it in my chapter. What the form that the silver took was, it was like broken off pieces of jewelry, amulets, sometimes they would actually make like ingots that were, the archaeologists call them chocolate bar ingots, because it looks like a Hershey chocolate bar where you can like snap off a piece, and the pieces you can clearly see that the pieces were intended to be about the same size. So people would like break off a little piece of silver to make a payment from these chocolate bars. And that's what they see in these hack silver hoards. So people would, bury some of their silver under their floor in their little hut, and maybe because of some crisis, some army is coming through, they have to abandon it, so they leave all their silver there, or maybe they forget about it. Either way, they found these hack silver hoards. And what's very interesting is the dozens and dozens of articles that are analyzing these hack silver hoards for their weight, for the purity of the silver inside. And what they all say is that when we match the weights of the individual pieces of the silver in these hoards with the balance weights that were made out of stone or some other material, the balance weights that were used as like a standard for weighing different things in the market to make sure that you're getting the right amount, the weights of the silver in these hack silver hoards correspond to the weights that the balance weights, right? So it's very clear that they were snapping off they weren't just like, cutting up pieces of silver to melt them down to make something new. It's very clear that they were cutting them up to achieve a certain weight so that they could make payments, so they could exchange with it. So it's just overwhelming in terms of the amount of evidence that shows that the MMT story of the origins of money is false. And it's great. When I was just learning Austrian economics, coming to Mises University for the first few times, like I would hear people talk about Menger's origins of money theory. And I just, it makes sense. Like, I don't see how money could originate in any other way. But I didn't, do the research to actually like look at the history of it, because it just seems like the theory makes, or maybe I thought in the back of my mind, this is something that must have happened prehistory, where we don't even have enough evidence to verify this based on the historical record. And so, finally, I guess I just said, enough is enough. I'm going to finally do this research to see what do archaeologists say, what are we finding in these clay tablets, and it
turns out it was Eddie Money. He invented it. Okay, well, yeah, great. And I'm sorry to interrupt you with my stupid joke.
Oh no, it's fine. I was done.
Okay, good. So yeah, let me just elaborate too on that coinage thing, because you're right. That's something people who grow up in the modern world where money is arbitrary pieces of paper that have official stamps on the, stamping and letters and numbers on them that the authorities designate. It's a conceptual hurdle to understand. When we say back in the day, gold and silver, for example, were the money, we mean that quite literally. It wasn't that you had to have a gold coin that was stamped by the proper authorities and that, if it had, a typo on it, then it wasn't legal tender. No, it was, the money was a certain weight of gold or silver of, a particular fineness or purity. But that's what it was, right? So if you just had a raw lump of gold, as long as it really was gold, and you weren't trying to pass off a baser metal, that was counterfeit, but as long as it really was gold, that was the money. And the function of coinage was just to like standardize it. So it'd be easy. Like if you wanted to go buy something, you could easily demonstrate to a merchant, yes, here are, whatever, here's a quarter ounce or something of this amount, gold. Right, as opposed to giving them a lump and then they have to go weigh it and then, oh, wait a minute, this is a little bit too much, let's shave some off. That's crazy. You wouldn't want to have to do that. So anyway, that was the function of the coinage. It was just to certify, and that's also why it's easy to imagine private mints, and there really were historically private mints, and guys like George Selgin have done a lot of work, and Larry White, just on how private mints used to operate. So this idea that people have that. And when I say people, I also mean MMTers. Like they will literally say, if you get into arguments on Twitter and someone's saying about, are taxes necessary to fund the government? And a lot of times they think their trump card is, you say, well, no, I mean, how can the government spend unless it taxes the people? And they'll say, well, where'd you get those dollars from? Right? Like they really do think money did not exist before the state, and that clearly the government has to first deficit spend, otherwise no one would have money. And it's just, that's so wrong theoretically, but also just looking at history, that's not where any of their modern monetary sovereign states got their money in the first place. Like that's another interesting quirk, is that the origin story of MMTers clearly does not apply to any of the major powers that right now they call monetary sovereign. So there's that element. Jonathan, I don't know if you already did it, and I just didn't catch it, but earlier we had teased saying, yes, I want to know, given that this is what we say as Austrians in response to the historical record with the clay tablets and the silver shekels. Did you say already what the MMTers counterpunch is on that?
I just sort of briefly alluded to it when I was talking about they sort of changed their story around. So one person said the shekel was certainly a unit of account, and it was used to pay for imports into Mesopotamia, but everyday transactions were done with credit. Everything had a price in silver, but it didn't have to be paid in silver. So it wasn't a medium of exchange. It was a unit of account. Which it's just hard for me to parse through that.
Okay, yeah, so. I saw something similar, and I don't know if we're talking about literally the same conversation but yeah, I saw somebody say that, and the guy, I asked the follow up and said to the guy, just so I could see where he was coming from, and I said, right now today in the United States, do you think the U.S. dollar is a medium of exchange? And he basically said no. He said no, it's because most transactions are conducted with bank credit, so he didn't think the U.S. dollar was the medium of exchange that Americans use, and so yeah, if you want to use words like that, okay. But by the same token, I can say, well, what I mean by money is the thing you roll at a bowling alley to knock the pins down. And so clearly the U.S. dollar is not money. It's what you guys call a bowling ball. I mean, you can do that if you want, but you've changed, the definitions around. So
So remember, we were talking about how the Austrians are especially suited to critique MMT. And so when I see this, when this guy is saying, oh, well, we all use bank credit for our transactions, it reminds me of the true money supply developed by Rothbard and Salerno, where they very clearly define the money supply as the thing that is the final means of payment. So even with these credit transactions that were happening, the final means of payment, what actually clears and settles the debt, they're saying that thing is the money. So it's just another example where like these key Austrian insights can be used to address the MMT.
And that probably, is a good springboard to the next controversy that we'll briefly discuss here. Is Jonathan picked another fight with another. You seem to pick on not just MMTers, but female MMTers. I don't know why you're picking on girls so much, but it's Patricia Pino. Her last name is Pino, and she is she is the co-host of the MMT podcast, and she's also associated with the Goer Initiative for Modern Money or Monetary Theory that's getting cut off on the Twitter handle there. So anyway, she is someone who has been tweeting a lot on MMT matters, and she's trained in economics and finance. I think she's got a master's of science. I'm just looking at her bio here so people understand who she is. But anyway, I follow her because I realized that, she tweets on this stuff a lot. And she had this interesting one recently, just a few days ago, where she said, you need at least two measures of value, one for commodities and one for money. Money cannot derive its value from the same thing commodities do. Money's value is enforced. And then in a follow-up tweet, she says, for commodities, you can choose the labor theory of value if you like, or energy as others propose. But money's value is all power. And the fact that we can denominate commodities value with, and she's got like the signs, the pound sign or the dollar sign, shows how power has appended itself to the production and distribution process. So in response to that, Jonathan, you said exhibit number 4 million, blah, 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 for why Austrian econ is especially suited to counter MMT. And you have a quote. Is that Mises who you're quoting there?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll turn it over to you. Do you want to elaborate on this episode?
So it was hard for me to make a lot of sense about what she was saying, but at least the basics of it, that she's proposing that you need two measures of value, one for commodities and one for money. I mean, this is not unique to MMTers. Like you see this in the monetary disequilibrium theory people and the monetarists, people saying that treating money as something that's special, it's more than a good or less than a good, and so they struggle to come up with a theory of the value of money. And so this is a great example of that, of saying you need two different measures of value, one based on labor or energy and the other one based on power, I guess. I don't really know what she's referring to or thinking about. And so I just use it as an opportunity to show here's the very straightforward, simple way that we can explain the value of money. And so I used a quote from Mises, where he said, others maintain that one should not speak of the demand for and the supply of money because the aims of those demanding money differ from the aims of those demanding vendible commodities. He continues, he says, this objection is no less invalid. And then at the end, he concludes, it does not alter the fact that the appraisement of money is to be explained in the same way as the appraisement of all other goods, by the demand on the part of those who are eager to acquire a definite quantity of it. And so this is I'm sure people are aware of this, but one thing that Mises discovered, realized, explained is that we can talk about the value of money in terms of supply and demand. And so this was something that really originated with him, and we should consider money just like any other good. And in fact, like if you think about Menger's theory of the origins of money, it's money arises out of indirect exchange where people are using a variety of media of exchange. And before that, people were just using direct barter, goods in kind, or goods for direct use in exchange for goods for direct use, which means that money originates out of this process where everything was a good. So money is a good that arises out of this process. It takes on some unique characteristics, but these unique characteristics don't take away money's goodness. So the fact that we can use money in economic calculation, the fact that economic calculation allows an expanded division of labor, the fact that we demand money so that we can use it in future exchanges, like all these sorts of things that are unique to money, it doesn't take away the fact that it is, at the end of the day, it's a good that we demand. And we demand it for a particular reason, which means that the way that we should explain its value is based on total stock of that good and the demand for it.
And just to clarify, when you said a minute ago, none of this should take away from money's goodness, you meant like its quality of being a good in economic. You didn't mean like, the existence of cancer should not diminish God's goodness. That's not what you meant like that. Okay. So yeah, great stuff. I think I'm actually more of an MMT whisperer than you are. I think I understand what she was getting at there.
Oh, please tell me.
So here's what she's saying. Go ahead.
Let me. Yes. I'll just give you one idea that I had when she's talking about money's value is all power. Is she referring to the fact that the demand for money is based on the state's ability to collect taxes?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah,
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Here's what she's doing. And by the way, folks, in case you're saying like, what was the context? I believe her tweets thread here was just a pure act of creation out of the brow of Zeus. I don't, she's not responding to somebody or whatever, you know what I mean? So like, this is just a standalone tweet where she said that. So what I think she's saying is, look, as MMTers, we know what gives the dollar its value. Oh, it's because the U.S. government says every April 15th, you owe us a certain number of dollars. And then that makes people scramble all during the rest of the year, selling goods and services, including their own labor, in order to get dollars, because they got to hand over the tax man so they don't go to jail, right? That's clear. And by the way, for folks at home, we are not at all strawmanning her, but they literally say that, okay? And we've covered this many times, and I'll cover it next week when I go through the Randall Ray lecture on this podcast episode next week. So there's that element. And so she's admitting, oh yeah, if you want to explain why is it that a gallon of milk trades in the marketplace for 5 apples in terms of their market value, it's not because the U.S. government also says, oh, and for satisfaction of your tax obligation, you can either give us 1 gallon of milk or 5 apples also. And those are equivalent in terms of reducing your tax liability. That's not how it works, right? So she's acknowledging, yes, economists need some framework to explain the relative market value of various goods, commodities out there in the world. But she's saying whatever it is that you use for that, and it's interesting, her 2 candidates were the labor theory of value or energy, as others propose, not, subjective value theory and utility, as some others, like 99% of current economists propose. You didn't even think of mentioning that. Even if to say, or the discredited, you know what I mean? Like she doesn't even mention it. Anyway, so that's kind of interesting. But she's saying whatever it is that you use to explain the relative market value of a gallon of milk and 5 apples, or an apple, is not what you would use to explain the power, the purchasing power of money, because that is clearly just flowing from the sovereignty and might of the state, because money gets its value from the state. So that, yes, I mean, your guess is correct, John. I'm certain that's what she's driving at there. And so again, just the irony. And let me underscore, folks. So that's we work for the Mises Institute. And geez, why do you guys like Mises so much? Among all his other contributions, and no, it wasn't just like, oh, because he doesn't like the government. I don't like the government, so he's my hero. No, the man was a scholarly genius, and among other contributions in what we call the theory of money and credit, which is sort of like his doctoral dissertation. That nomenclature doesn't quite carry over back to his context, but he, as Jonathan said, unified what might be called micro and macro. That Carl Menger was one of the 3 pioneers of the so-called marginal subjectivist revolution, where you explained the relative valuation of goods based on subjective utility and so on. But economists thought, yeah, we can use that. They were having Patricia's mindset. They thought, yeah, you can explain the relative value of oranges and apples by reference to utility, and then the more for the marginal utility, okay, fine. But when it came to money, they thought that would just be arguing in a circle, because if you said, why do you value money? Because you can buy things with it. And so, whereas you value an apple because it's satisfies your hunger, or you like apple pie, or you like apple juice, whatever, right? So when it comes to why do you value apples, it's not because, because I can sell them down the road and they have purchasing power, right? There's a different explanation. But with money, qua money, the reason you value it is because of its purchasing power. So economists before Mises thought you're just arguing in a circle if you try to explain the purchasing power of money by appeal to its purchasing power. And so Mises solved that with the so-called regression theorem to break it up and say, no, it's like today's purchasing power of money is based on ultimately like our recollection of what its purchasing power was yesterday, given some anticipations about, the changes we might expect. But that's kind of what the link, just like if you woke up from a coma and someone said, hey, I'll give you $100,000 for your memoir about what was it like back in the day when you first went in your coma, you would need to say, well, how much can $100,000 buy right now? I need to go check prices, right? You would have no frame of reference. So Mises gets out of that circular argument by breaking up chronologically. And then they thought, now there's an infinite regress, right? Today's purchasing power of money, you just explained by yesterday's, and he said, no, Menger showed us where that stops. He, explained how you could have just a state of pure direct exchange and then money emerges out of that. So anyway, that was kind of the contribution Mises made, was to show how the subjective marginal revolution that the economists used to explain the valuation of different commodities could also be applied to money. So he unified micro and macro is one way of putting it.
So I'm looking forward to your episode on Ray's lecture, because I watched through it, probably because you put it on my social media feed, and he actually refers to that circularity. So I'm sure you will, but hopefully you'll bring up the regression theorem as a knockout punch to that idea.
There's going to be so many. I mean, he'll already be on the canvas out cold, and it'll be like a knockout kick at that point, or a redundant kick. It won't even be a knockout kick.
But you see, I don't just critique the female MMTers. See, Ray is a man, and also in my article I talk about Innis as well.
Yes, very good. There's
an equal opportunity refuter.
Yes, there is no discrimination here at the Mises Institute. Okay, well, maybe is the final thing here, just tying up loose ends. I imagine some people might say, either fans who just think you guys missed something here, or certainly opponents might say, you guys have conveniently ignored, Murphy alluded to it, the stunning objection to your whole narrative is that we don't have records. Archaeologists have never found and anthropologists have never stumbled upon a society built on barter exchange. So checkmate, Austrians. I know, I have some things to say, but I don't want to keep hogging this episode. Do you want to say what you think about that?
So I actually referred to this in the draft of my chapter. And so I say barter comes first, though the historical record of this will likely be scarce or non-existent due to the necessarily primitive nature of barter economies and the unimportant, from the prehistoric person's perspective, nature of these common exchanges. So we wouldn't expect there to be like this, I traded, one sheep for 15 chickens, right? I mean, there would be no reason to record that. If it's a spot exchange and it happens, both parties walk away with the mutual benefit. There's no reason to write it down as like a receipt or a record of the transaction. But I mean, not only that, those sorts of exchanges happened before writing anyway. So by the time writing is being invented, with these cuneiform tablets, is one great. I'm not sure if that was like the first writing, but that's one of the earliest forms of writing. It looks like people were already using silver as money, if not a very dominant medium of exchange. Even so, I found an historian, there we go, Powell from 1996. So he's actually talking, and he doesn't take a side in this MMT versus Austrian debate. He might not even be aware of the different economic theories of the origins of money, but he wrote this article about the historical and archaeological evidence for the origins of money. And he said, barter must have taken place everywhere and often in ancient Mesopotamia, and is probably the major reason we have so little evidence for exchange of cheap commodities, especially in small amounts, in cuneiform documents. So here, I mean, the historians, the archaeologists, they understand, that just because something is written down or chiseled into a piece of clay that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that was happening during that time period. So, but I mean, we have to speculate. It's not like we have, video recordings of what was going on back then.
Yeah, great. I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said. And yeah, just the way I would have put it is, as I think you're alluding to as well, look, certainly by the time you have a flourishing civilization with detailed records and temple authorities and clearly at that point, they would have already, this process Menger talked about would have already occurred, right? Like it's sort of like the evolution of language that, unless you think, you believe in the Genesis account or something that God directly imbued Adam and Eve. But for most people who have a more secular view of things, like, oh yeah, there must have been a point before humans had like formal language and it was grunting or who knows what. And so it would be silly to say we have no written records of people before language was developed, right? Like that would be a dumb thing to say, right? And so therefore it must not have existed. That'd be silly, right? So likewise, the fact that we don't have historical records of transactions occurring before money, that really isn't the death blow you think. Because again, the Mengerian story, it's a very natural, quick process. And we have one in real time. That's the thing too that amazes me. We have sort of a lab experiment, namely the POW camps in World War II. There's a famous article, not by an Austrian, this guy Radford, who was a trained economist. I think he was in the British, the Royal Air Force, and was shot down and was in a German POW camp. And then the rations packets that the Red Cross would give, to the POWs, they would contain like 2 cigarettes or something every time those things would come in. And then the cigarette quickly became the money among the prisoners in this camp. And Radford, as a trained economist, was really observant and could tell, he noticed things that maybe the other guys wouldn't have occurred to them to observe. But anyway, so that wasn't because the German guards were demanding a tobacco tribute. That's not why it happened. And so, we can see, and it wasn't that from day one the cigarettes were money. No, at first the prisoners were just trading, I don't smoke. What will you give me for my cigarette? I need shoelaces. Oh, okay, that kind of stuff. And then it just became clear, let's quote everything in terms of cigarettes. They had blackboards with prices and there was supply and demand. I mean, it was really, when the new packets came in, there was a lot of, like some guards were smuggling in cigarettes from the outside to the prisoners because they were getting, giving them. And then all of a sudden cigarette prices went up because there was an influx, there was inflation, right? So anyway, I'm just saying, we have a historical example of that happening in real time, and yet they're so sure that, oh no, that didn't happen historically. And then the other thing, Nick Rowe, the economist out of Canada, made a good point. When my article first emerged, my review of Graeber, Jonathan, some of the MMTer types and other post-Keynesians or whatever who may not be MMTers but like Graeber's work were mocking me and making this point that how come we don't have a reference to evidence of a society based on barter. And Nick Rowe was saying that would be like if a physicist were explaining why when someone jumps in the pool and the level of the water at the deep end goes up at first and then but then it quickly equilibrates, saying, well, how come we don't have any records of a pool where the deep end the water is much higher in terms of where it's hitting the pool versus the other end of the pool, or stuff like that. And he's saying because the whole point is we're giving reasons to show why that would quickly be equilibrated and you wouldn't see that anymore. So anyway, just different ways of trying to get to the basic point here that the historical record is entirely consistent. In fact, I would go so far, Jonathan, as to say if an anthropologist did stumble upon some tribe somewhere that was unconnected to the outside world where they were using barter and it was clear that as far back as they could go, oh yes, back 19 generations we've just been using barter, they would have more of a leg to stand on to say, aha, Menger, you're clearly wrong because according to you, they should have quickly advanced to using media of exchange and then one of them should have outstripped the others to be money. And yet they're stuck in barter. So you Austrians are wrong. So if anything, anyway, I'll let you have the last word. You got anything that you want to say to my rant?
The last thing I'll say is that another point in favor of Menger's theory is that the silver that was used had a non-monetary use. And so if you just think about like why people would start to demand silver, even before it came to be used as money, and it's because it had non-monetary uses. It was shiny, you can make jewelry out of it, you could make nice dishes or cups out of it, that sort of thing. So, I mean, there are all of these non-monetary uses of the thing. And then even though Austrians say that it's not necessary for that good to continue to have non-monetary uses, to be used as money. So, I mean, case in point, we use the US dollar now, but the US dollar doesn't have non-monetary use. So after the thing becomes money, it sort of it takes on a life of its own, and people will use it because of the history of prices, expectation that people will accept it in exchange in the future. Doesn't need that non-monetary use. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the fact that silver did have non-monetary use shows that, or at least points back in time to people started to demand this originally because it had non-monetary uses, which you can't explain or doesn't make sense in the MMT view.
Yep. Very good. Exactly. Well, that's a good place to wrap up. So as always, Jonathan, thanks so much for your time, and keep fighting those women on Twitter.
Thanks, Bob, for having me.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.